So,
yes, it is.
Good, thank you. So the title of my talk may have occasioned some puzzlement in the audience, Mongol sources on the Great Western Expedition, or I realized I actually covered the other smaller ones that came before, so I've now slightly retitled it to Mongol sources on the Western expeditions to conquer Eastern Europe. You might be thinking, isn't there only one source, the secret history of the Mongols, with all the other non-local sources being Persian or Chinese? And what exactly are analytical comments? I mean, isn't all scholarship supposed to be analytical? But these phrases go together. By analytical, I mean what M.L. West meant by that term in his magisterial analytical commentaries, as he called them, on the Iliad and the Odyssey. Commentaries that analyzed or broke down the Iliad and the Odyssey into its component parts, the text blocks, which Homer, as a cut and paste artist, assembled to make his masterpieces. Now, of course, whether Homer really was a cut and paste artist is still controversial, despite M.L. West's vigorous assertion of this proposition. I don't intend to argue about Homer here, but I do assert that all of the major sources on the Mongol Empire, Persian, Chinese, and Mongolian, were written by cut and paste artists, and hence are susceptible to the analytical methodology of breaking them down into source blocks. Now, certain writers such as Giovanni and the Secret Historian, which is my term for the author of the Secret History of the Mongols, have a relatively heavy hand on the sources and hence can in some cases alter the blocks enough to make the suture lines not exactly clear. But others such as Rashid ad-Din and the Eurasian compilers were engaged in mass production and had little time to curate the blocks. They were cutting and pasting. Still others, like the compilers of the Authentic Chronicles genre, Chinese style, East Asian genre I will introduce later, work slowly and carefully, but with an idea that history should limit their role as much as possible to assembling previously tested historical narratives. For them too, the suture lines are pretty obvious. Regardless of the details, one of the conclusions of these analytical comments will be that behind the Chinese and Persian sources and behind the Secret History of the Mongols are a series of other sources which were written in Mongolian. And it's for this reason that I speak of Mongolian sources in the plural. The Secret History is not the only Mongolian history about which we can know something, but is rather one rather largish source that made use of a number of smaller Mongolian language histories, biographies, and other fragmentary materials. Some of the other sources were also translated and cut up and pasted into known histories in Chinese and Persian. Analysis thus creates a rather different roster of sources, and in many cases gives more precision about their dates and original context than we might have otherwise expected. As a result, evaluating the historicity of a given passage often depends less on evaluating what Rashid ad-Din or the early Ming dynasty compilers of the Eurasian around 1370 knew and thought, and more evaluating on what their source, often a compiler decades earlier, knew and thought. Ultimately, in an analytical study of the many well-known sources on the Mongol Empire reveals the existence of a repertoire of more or less official historiographical practices in the empire conducted in Mongolian. Unfortunately, the center of this Mongolian language of historiography was on the opposite end of the empire from the northwestern campaigns in Europe. And hence those campaigns were somewhat peripheral to that body of work's main concerns. Still, this historiography shaped several of the well-known sources on the conquest. Moreover, the peculiarities of this historiography give us some important insights on the interaction, or perhaps lack thereof, between the small groups of Mongols who designed and carried out the conquest on the one hand, and the other small groups who wrote the histories on the other. So in what follows, I'll consider the Mongolian sources on the Great Western Campaign of 1236 and 41, and the two Western campaigns that preceded it. First, that of 1217, 1219 against the sons of Tokhta the Merkit, who had taken refuge among the Uzvedli Kipchaks around the Gem-Jaik basin in western Kazakhstan. And then that of 1220 to 1223, led by Jeb and Subede, that followed the conquest of, were following the conquest of Khwarezm and originated in the hunting down of Muhammad, the Khwarezm Shah. My order will not be strictly chronological, but arranged in order of increasing complexity of the analytical problems. First, I'll consider the biographical and analytic sources compiled around the era of Kublai Khan and shortly thereafter. Then I will show how the Persian histories of these campaigns build up their accounts through successively adding increasingly large Mongolian origin source blocks. Then I will analyze the secret histories passages on these campaigns, dividing them again into source blocks. These analytical comments will conclude by considering the connections between all of these sources thus excavated, showing how several of them have a common origin, but several of them also don't. Finally, I will consider what these sources tell us about the writing of history, its relation to military action in the Mongol Empire. So the era of Kublai Khan marks a dramatic change in the historiography of the Mongol Empire. Contrary to popular belief, however, this change was not simply a wholesale replacement of Mongolian language historiography with Chinese language, East Asian style historiography. Rather, it was a complex merger of Mongolian historiography, which had already been influenced to some extent by East Asian biographical writing, with the genres of biographies and authentic chronicles. These were the primary genres I'll be considering. Now, biographies, Kublai Khan's reign focused on two genres. The social, what we call biography, sometimes called social biography, and authentic chronicles. Now, in the Chinese tradition, biographies were commissioned upon the death of an official or upon the occasion of him and or upon the occasion of being granted an official title. These biographies were usually written by colleagues or associates of the deceased with the input of the surviving family members. Such biographies could also be enshrined in the Chinese literary tradition as fine examples of the author's style and his membership in elite social networks. That's why it's sometimes called social biography. Unfortunately, we do not know enough about Mongolian language historical networks to say if that same function of documenting social networks, which we just heard a wonderful paper about by Matt Coulter, was in play. But we do know that similar such biographies intended to document deceased officials' achievements and the validity of their descendants' privileges were composed in Mongolian as early as the reign, at least of Ögedei Khan, around the 1230s. We also know that in at least one case, that achievement of Mongol commanders were reported to the imperial shrines, that is to say the hordes or orda, the tent palaces of the deceased Chinggis. This too would imply the existence of a genre of encomia written in Mongolian or eulogies written in Mongolian. Now, the link of these biographies to the death or posthumous honors granted by the subject of the biography is useful for dating because it means that the biography's date is usually often encoded within the work itself and thus can survive translation and incorporation into a different format. The final item in such a biography is oftentimes a statement that this person received such and such a title on such and such a date, and that is can sometimes be confidently assigned to be the date of the composition of the biography. Now, with regard to the Western expeditions, there are 3 Chinese language biographies that contain significant amounts of relevant material. 2 of them at least appear from their form to be translations from Mongolian originals. These 2 are the biographies of Ismail and Suwede, the famous Suwede Batar. A third, the biography of Tutkak, appears to be a biography composed in Chinese, although possibly on the basis, and I would say likely on the basis of some pre-existing Mongolian text. There are other sources we can consider, but these 3 would give us a nice set of the sort of methodological problems involved in identifying them. Now, the biography of Ismail documents the career of one of the commanders who served under Jebba during the Great Western Reconnaissance Expedition of 1220 to 1223. It survives in a brief summary included in the Liezhuan or rank biography sections of the Yuanshi. This Chinese summary is extremely sloppy with numerous errors, including one even in the subject's name, turning Ismail or Ismaili in Chinese transcription into Hosmaili. This confused people for quite a while. Perhaps even more egregious error is that in an account of the campaign in North China against the Jin, it confuses the Chinese title of Ögedei with Genghis Khan. Now, although these errors were produced in the Chinese, the crudity of the language and the large number of very idiosyncratic place names, including, for example, an unattested Uyghur place name, Ihir 2 cliffs, for a place in the Tangut Empire, indicates that it was translated from a foreign language. One would assume that a biography composed in Chinese would use Chinese place names for areas in China. The presence of many names with a Z, a phoneme not normally found in Mongolian, might indicate a Uyghur original, but Z is attested as a special transcription letter in Mongolian, Middle Mongolian, when rendering Tibetan and Persian names. And there are other transcriptions show the typical Mongolian renderings of, say, for example, Jebe rather than Yeme, and Kizil as Kishil. That's a kind of classic Mongol error of Turkic names. So the original language was probably Mongolian, but written by a scribe aware of and willing to render in Chinese a special Z of Uyghur and Persian place names. This biography of Ismail ends with the death, his death in the year Imao, or 1255. But appended to it is a notice on his son Miliki, or Miliji, who died fighting the Song dynasty in Jungtong III, or 1262. Given that the text was evidently not revised, this notice must have been the original, and it's probably on account of Miliki's death that he and his father were honored with a court biography. So thus, despite the crudity of this biography, it is important as the only extensive witness in Chinese sources to the career of Jebe. And that's some interesting comments about the battle on the Kalka River, for example. Jebe having died in the field in 1223 and apparently without descendants, Jebe himself was not given any biography on his own account in Mongolian or other languages. But vastly more important for our knowledge of the Western expeditions is Subodh Bhattar's biography. This text was preserved in 3 Chinese witnesses. 2 are included, and I'm going to let's move to here. This is a table of affiliation of his biographical materials. This text is preserved in 3 Chinese witnesses, which you can go ones to the right here being more the more modern one. 2 are included in the Yuanshi, and one probably the most notorious illustration of the Yuanshi compilers' haste and sloppiness is that they didn't realize that the biography of Subutai is the same as the biography of Xuebutai, slightly different in Chinese, even less different at the time, but still they should have realized it's the same person. The 3rd is preserved in the temple stele inscription by Wang Yun, recounting the achievements of Subodh's grandson, Aju, as grounds for Aju's canonization. In other words, they're saying Aju is a great guy. He has all these great achievements. Moreover, he is the grandson of a great guy and his son of a great guy. So it's a family enshrinement and also family history. The 2nd biography, that of Xuebutai, ends with his death in Guyuk's year 3, or 1248, and then the granting of a posthumous title to Subodh by Hobelai Khan's court in Juryuan 1, or 1264. The other 2 witnesses, that of Yuanshi's Subutai and the temple stele by Wang Yun, were folded into biographies of Subodh's son and grandson, respectively. Thus, although they afforded witness to the text, they did not preserve the original date and context. That initial context would be, at least for the Chinese edition, would be provided by the Xuebutai version, which can thus be dated to 1264. Comparison of the Chinese transcriptions of the Mongolian names in these 3 versions allow us to identify the process by which a Mongolian text was translated into Chinese. When translating, should we note first, when translating Chinese names, non-Chinese names into Chinese, proper nouns are rendered by taking Chinese characters that have roughly the same pronunciation, syllable by syllable. But since Chinese, however, has lots of homonyms, 2 different translators working independently will, as a rule, make different choices. So thus, Subodh's, and here I guess I actually put it, I realized last night I should have put it in the, let me see if I can put it in the chat right now. I guess I could have to go out of this. Maybe I will stop the share and just put it right in the chat so that you can actually see these names. This is a name for Nirbi, someone, and these show you the difference. Even if you don't know Chinese, Chinese is nice and graphic. You can see that right at the end of it, it looks different. That will give us, that shows you an example of how, of some of the, that different characters, which are both have the pronunciation B, but one, they're different. So the Chinese transcription of the non-Chinese terms in Subutai and Wang Yun's version are almost all the same, but those in Xuebutai show pervasive differences. Now, so here we see, for example, the same name Subutai is Xuebutai or Subutai, not exactly a homonym, but fairly close. Now, another interesting difference between them is that Xuebutai uses reign year dates. So, for example, one episode happens in year 7 of Genghis Khan for 1211, while the other ones would use Ren Shun for the same year. So as a result, this is how we, from this data, we can get the following table. So both the anonymous biography of Subudai's son Urankadai and Wang Yun, when writing the biography of his grandson Aju, must have incorporated an identical Chinese language base text, but then they made certain changes in it. Now, this affiliation of the text is important for 2 reasons. First of all of the surviving versions were abbreviated. It's only by careful comparison of all 3 of these extant texts, the ones here on the right-hand side, that we can establish the original text. For example, the battle on the Gem River in western Kazakhstan that concluded his original campaign to the west against Mirket Tokhta Beki's son, Subudai's campaign against Tokhta Beki's son, is dated in the Xuebutai biography to Genghis Khan year 11 or 1217. In the Subutai biography, however, this one, we find the campaign begins in year Bingzi or 1217 and only ends in year Ji Mao. So what we see is that in the process of editing the Chinese translation, the Yuanshi editors created a misleading date of 217 for the battle in the Xuebutai translation. Now, also important for our purposes that the contrast in transcription and dating between the Xuebutai version and the other 2 proves definitively that these are both 2 independent translations of a single Mongolian original. They're so similar that it's clear it's a single Mongolian original, but the different dating conventions and the different transcriptions show that those translations were done from Mongolian into Chinese independently. The concluding date on the Xuebutai version of 1264 makes that the likely date of the first Chinese translation. The Mongolian version would have to have been written presumably at the same time or earlier. But the death of Subudai in 1248 establishes the earliest possible date. Now, if we look at the actual content of the biography, one of the striking aspects of the second half of it is that it's the way in which Batu is repeatedly told that he has to he's not as good of a warrior as Subudai. He has to submit to correction on Subudai's part. And this suggests from the political implications of that the Mongolian original was compiled during a period when Guyuk, Batu's hostile cousin, was on the throne. However, 16 years later, when Subudai was given a Chinese title, a translation into Chinese was made. Later on, perhaps around 1275, when Oryankadai, Subudai's son, died, a fresh translation from the Mongolian might have been made for his title. And that translation was then reused with a few modifications again when his grandson Aju passed away in 1287. Now, a more typical Chinese-style social biography can be seen in the biography of Totkak. By the way, this name has been reconstructed in a number of different ways, Tutuka, Totkak, and so on and so forth. It's only recently I realized that his name is found in a Genghis Khan ritual text later on in Mongolia, and so I think we can now realize that Totkak is in fact the original form. This is a famous Kipchak general, descendant of the Oberli Kipchak ruler Inas. And the earliest version of this text dates to the death and his death and memorialization after Kublai's death in 1297. So this version was compiled by a noted Chinese literatist named Yan Fu, showing how by this time even Eurasian generals were part of this network of mutual esteem from Chinese literati. Later on, as Tutkak's descendants Chongwar and El Timur gained even greater fame, Yan Fu's biography was incorporated as a history of the family written by Yuji around 1330. Now, so both Yan Fu's version and Yuji's version were then incorporated in their respective subjects' Yuanshi biographies. Now, Yen Fu's version, the earlier one, has an interesting exchange of colorful metaphors in terms of between Genghis Khan and the Kipchak ruler. The Kipchak ruler has given refuge to the Merkits from whoever's escaping Genghis Khan. So here it reads, the great founder, Genghis Khan, conquered the Merkit and their ruler, Godu, fled to the Kipchaks. A messenger was sent to deliver a message to Inas saying, why do you hide the moose we marked with our arrow? Give it back this instant, lest the disaster reach you as well. Inas replied to the messenger saying, the sparrow that flees the falcon hides in the underbrush as if it can save its life. Can I then be less than any plant? So as George Carr has shown, these metaphors of the moose with the arrow in it and the bush protecting the little bird, these are traditional and well attested in Turco-Mongolian diplomacy as a way of referring to asylum and refusal of asylum. As we will see, something very like the moose we marked with our arrow is found in the Secrets to the Mongols in a parallel passage. Now, but that's only in Yen Fu's version. But Yuji's version doesn't include this colorful metaphor, but it does give the name of Godu as Kiskodu. So Kiskodu, what is Kiskodu? Kiskodu, Kis is actually a relatively rare Mongolian epithet meaning hostile term, and this term is not found in Yen Fu's version. In other words, so he's calling him Kiskodu or hostile Godu. In other words, both Yen Fu's 1297 version and Yuji's 1330 version independently preserve distinctive Mongolian vocabulary and language about this exchange. And that strongly suggests to me that they are independently drawn on a Mongolian version. Yet in this case, the wording of the Chinese also shows that Yuji drew extensively on Yen Fu's version. There's a lot of verbatim similarity. And both accounts are written in an elegant Chinese style that masks most traces of the Mongolian style. So it's impossible to exclude the possibility that one or both of these Mongolian elements may have been taken from moral versions supplied by the family, although I find that possibility somewhat unlikely. In other words, I think it's more likely that they in fact had a Mongolian original, although it's a little bit hard to exclude other possibilities. Now, another genre of historical literature actively pursued under Kublai Khan was that of the authentic chronicles. This genre developed under the Tang Dynasty several hundred years earlier. They're called Shilu in Chinese, often translated by sinologists rather stiltedly as veritable records. Now, as Thomas Olson pointed out, this genre was known in its Mongolian form to the Persian historian Rashid ad-Din as a, quote, reign by reign authentic chronicle. The Mongolian name was probably Magat Tofchan, although so far this term is unattested in Mongolian. As the name indicates, they were composed reign by reign. Now, although biographical writing had begun before Kublai's reign, there's no evidence for such chronicles of exactly that genre before his reign, although there were some other chronological campaign histories that are both that we know that are mentioned in the sources and also that we can partially reconstruct. So about the authentic chronicle of Genghis Khan, the first one, Genghis Khan, we're rather well informed as we have three different witnesses to the original text. A Persian translation made from the Mongolian, which is preserved as the base text for Rashid ad-Din's History of Genghis Khan. A Chinese version included around 1319 in a multi-reign chronicle called the Campaigns of Genghis Khan, or the famous Shengwu Qinzhenglu, partially translated by Pelliot. And thirdly, an edited version which was turned into the basic annals of Genghis Khan in the Yuanshi in 1370. Now, for the later ones, however, we have fewer witnesses. For the authentic chronicle of Ogedei Khan, Genghis Khan's successor, we have a witness in the Campaigns of Genghis Khan and in the Yuanshi. And finally, though, for Guyuk and Monka, however, we have only the third type of witness, that is to say, it was incorporated in the Yuanshi. And that's a bit unfortunate because it's these later reigns that tell us the most about the Great Western Expedition, and it's these later, and the Yuanshi itself is of the witnesses is the one that is most free in its handling of the material. So the earlier, I should say also, and I had a section here, which in the interest of time, I'll omit that it was, these authentic chronicles were compiled bilingually. That's to say, there was a Chinese version and a Mongolian version, and they were sort of an interlinear translation format. Appears to be that best explains the evidence of the text. The earlier expeditions of 1217 to 19 and 1220 to 1223 correspond to the reigns of Chinggis Khan. Both, therefore, are mentioned in his authentic chronicles, but with relatively little detail. So here, the following passages. In the cow year, 1217, Chinggis Khan sent the great general Subedai Batur with carts having iron-shod wheels to wage war on the Merkit and to combine forces with Tokhachar, who had previously been sent to wage war in the west as a vanguard with 22,000 cavalry. Upon reaching the Gem River, the modern Emba in western Kazakhstan, they met the Merkit's chief Godu, gave battle, and completely destroyed them before returning. Later on, under the horse year 1222, which is a mistake, it should probably be 2 years earlier. At that time, the Sultan of the Sartol, Jalaluddin, or the Sultan of the Westerners, Jalaluddin, fled. Jebba was thus ordered to pursue him as vanguard, and Subedai Batur was also sent as his reserve. Tokhachar was also sent to bring up their rear. Jebba reached the cities of Melik Khan or Khan Melik. This was one of the commanders of the Sultan, Khwarezmian Sultan, and passed by without molesting them. Subedai Batur did the same. But when Tokhachar arrived, he gave battle on Melik Khan's frontier cities. Melik Khan was afraid and fled, abandoning those cities. This expedition then turns into the first foray into the Western steppe, as we know, after Sultan Muhammad dies, Subedai and Jebba continue on around the Caspian Sea. But that's not a fact that's actually mentioned in this authentic chronicle of Chinggis Khan. Even more disappointing is the authentic chronicle of Ogedei's reign, during which the Great Western Expedition happened. In the more earlier and more extensive witness, that's to say the Shengwu Qinzhenglu, or campaigns of Chinggis Khan, in fact, there's no mention whatsoever of the Great Western campaign. It's just not mentioned. It's kind of shocking. The Yuanshe's basic annals of Ogedei, drawn from the authentic chronicle, does record some of the bare bones, how Batu, Guyuk, and Monka were assigned to the campaign in the west in 1235, and it then gives two telegraphic notices about each to each for Guyuk and for Monka. And in fact, given their absence in the other witness, the more detailed witness, the passages specifically about Guyuk and Monka were probably taken from earlier Guyuk and Monka's own authentic chronicles and then inserted, when the Yuanshe people were editing it in 1370, inserted it into the Ogedei Khan's chronicle. The Guyuk's annals mentions victory against the Asot, or the Ossetians. The one under the reign of Ogedei only mentions his summon to return. So those in Monka's annals mention his famous parting of the waters. We'll refer to that many times, where Monka parts the waters and he gets to capture Bachman. These waters are the Volga, not the Red Sea, but the divine guidance is intended to be the same in the two cases. So if you put the ones that are in the Ogedei authentic chronicle and those in Guyuk and Monka, they kind of fit together nicely, so that it indicates that they were probably originally part of a story about the pre-coronation of these pre-coronation achievements of these people, rather than in actual Ogedei's annals themselves. So the authentic chronicles are the most disappointing as material for the Western expedition. We would have expected much better, but unfortunately they're quite inadequate. That of Chinggis Khan in particular remains important, however, because its literal cut and paste method of compilation preserves in other passages some important information about the sources, to which we'll return later. So next I'll consider the possible Mongolian material preserved in the Persian sources. Here, I'm not going to work backward from the latest materials as I did with the Chinese sources, but rather move forward from those with no Mongolian material on those expeditions, Juzjani and Ibn al-Athir, which do not use Mongolian sources, to those who use some, Juvayni and Rashid ad-Din. And in so doing, we can see how Mongolian sources played a key role in enriching what was originally, at least in Juzjani at least, a very bare bones account. At the same time, the step-by-step insertion makes the suture points between the sources, between the discrete source blocks, rather clear. So I had a discussion about Juzjani and Ibn al-Athir, which I will omit for the in the interest of time, let me just say that Juzjani does not use Mongolian sources for these Western expeditions, and it's very, very brief. Ibn al-Athir also does not use Mongolian sources, but he's actually extremely extensive, and his account is to this day is probably the main narrative history of the Western expedition, but without Mongolian sources. Now, writing around the same time, Giovanni's account is much richer, due in large than Juzjani's, for example, due in large part to the incorporation of Mongolian language materials into his history. His account of the 1217 to 1219 expedition against the Merkit adds a correct understanding of its purpose to pursue Tokta Özbeki's son, and adds two place names and understanding of the battle's course that do agree with Mongolian biographical sources preserved in Chinese translation, that of Suba de Bater and of Yerot or Liuga. The account of the course of the battle is also found in Ibn al-Athir, who doesn't use Mongolian sources, but the battle place names may derive directly or indirectly from Mongolian accounts. On the 1220 to 1230 expedition around the Caspian Sea, Giovanni has two accounts, one from the point of view of the pursuing Mongols under Yeme, as he calls him, in Subade, and one from the point of view of the fleeing Sultan of Khwarezm. Neither account, however, has much trace of Mongolian sources, except that he does actually explicitly quote a document bearing, quote, the Al-Tamga in the Uyghur script and a copy of the Yadlik of Genghis Khan. And he quotes that as evidence of Mongol intentions. However, the decree is quite generic and certainly didn't give him much concrete information. So it's more decoration than actually a source. Now, for the Great Western Expedition, however, Giovanni has a list of commanders and targets for the preliminary operations of 1229 and 34, and also of the final operations in 1235, placed under his Annals of Ogedei. Like Juzjani, however, he subsumes his most detailed account under the Annals of Batu. Giovanni's actual content consists of, one, a much more detailed list of commanders and targets of the campaign. Two, an account of the siege of the Asot or Ossetian city of Magas, centered on Munka's actions. And three, an account of the Battle of Muhi, centered on Batu's actions. And finally, in Giovanni's pre-coronation Annals of Munka, he also includes a version of Munka parting the waters to capture Bachman, the evil Kipchak bandit. For these accounts, Giovanni was certainly making use of Mongolian sources, and probably written. Several things indicate the Mongolian source nature. First, in describing the city of Magas, this Ossetian city in the Caucasus, he describes its inhabitants as, quote, as numerous as ants and locusts, while its environs were entangled with woods and forests, such that even a serpent could not penetrate them. Now, the first metaphor is rather generic, although one can imagine a Mongol more easily than a Muslim being impressed with the density of population for a Caucasus forest town. But the second metaphor is, however, directly paralleled in the Secrets of the Mongols. When young Temujin is escaping the Merkit in the woods of Borkhan Khaldun in Mongolia, they are described as, quote, with the quicksands and tangled woods, deep forests, tangled so that a glutted snake could not slither into them. It's the exact same metaphor for a forest so thick, snake couldn't enter. Secondly, Giovanni uses the term Kedel for the Hungarian kingdom. And this is not attested in any previous Persian source. And in fact, Rashid ad-Din changes it when he edits Giovanni's source. But it is found in Secrets of the Mongols. And in of course, it's from the word Karol, Karolus, king, Kirai in Hungarian. But that meaning of it as being used not for the title, but as the actual kingdom is a distinctively Mongolian sort of misunderstanding. So Giovanni, including that, shows that he's making use of Mongolian sources. Thirdly, the event he chose to narrate parallel the rise of Monka in the Chinese pre-coronation accounts. Likewise, the account of the Battle of Muhi portrays Batu and his brother Shiba Khan entirely positively. Unlike the Guyak era accounts of Subade, which glorify Subade and denigrate Batu's contributions. It's interesting, in Giovanni, Subade doesn't appear at all, in fact. In other words, the items fit what we expect of an account given around the 1251 seizure of power by Monka with the aid of Batu. These are the people who look good in Giovanni's account. Such an account may have been given orally, a Mongolian account may have been given orally, but given the phrasing and terminology borrowings from Mongolian noted above, I'd suggest that a written origin and something that is more or less transparently political propaganda may have been in case. Now, finally, we come to Rashid ad-Din. Completing his Ghaznid Chronicle around 1304, his Ghaznid Chronicle was later folded into his Compendium of Chronicles, Jami at-Tawarikh. Around 1304, Rashid ad-Din moved further on the process of Mongolizing his narrative of the Western expeditions. Although he didn't have any new information on the 1217-1219 campaign of Jochi and Subede, he greatly expanded the section on 1220 to 1223. And I should say in his narrative sections, actually, he does, in the biographies, he does have some new information on that. He greatly, his analytic sections has no new information. He greatly expanded the section on 1220 to 1223's hunt for Khwarezm Shah and subsequent reconnaissance around the Caspian Sea. Almost all of the exact events of this account, however, can be traced to Jovany's account of the chase, his account of Khwarezm Shah's flight, or else to Ibn al-Athir's account of the Western Tatars in the campaigns. In other words, he's using Ibn al-Athir and Jovany. To this, however, he added material undoubtedly translated from a Mongolian text. And this material is a charge. Chinggis Khan gives a charge to Jebenoyan, Subede Batar, and Tokhachar Batar, telling them, pursue the Sultan, don't touch anything else, and then find him and kill him, and then go around the Kipchak's neck and back to Mongolia. By the way, relative to what we're talking about with the Moravian, passing through Moravia, it's the same idea. When you're hunting a hostile leader, you don't want to distract yourself with sacking and pillaging and burning. You want to focus on keep your eyes on the prize. So that was what this charge was telling them to do. But this charge is translated from Mongolian, I would regard as indubitable. First of all, the text replaces a much simpler, shorter text in Jovany, and hence it can't have been derived from Rashid ad-Din's Persian or Arabic sources. Second, it uses the Mongol term gidzik or gijige in Middle Mongolian, which is literally a pigtail, but is used throughout as a meaning a reinforcement. And it's used the exact same way in the Secrets of the Mongols, describing the same campaign. So Jebe is sent, Subede is Jebe's gidzik or pigtail or supporter, and Tokhachar is Subede's gidzik or pigtail or supporter. Second, the ruler they are chasing is called first the Sultan. The Sultan, Rashid ad-Din adds other names later, but he primarily calls him Sultan. And that was the Mongolian title for these figures. He uses the phrase twice, with the strength of the great God, which is clearly a translation of the Mongolian, by the power of eternal heaven, Monchatingarin Kachundur. And finally, a set of passages describing how the Sultan might escape and how they have to chase him strongly recalls similar passages with which Chinggis Khan addressed Subede in the Secret History of the Mongols. So in Rashid ad-Din we read, if he cannot withstand you and takes refuge with some men on a steep mountain or in a narrow cave, or if he hides himself from the sight of men like a peri, you must blow into his territory like a strong wind. Secret History reads, if they become winged and fly up to the sky, won't you, Subede, become a falcon and fly up to seize them? If they become a marmot and dig into the ground with their nails, will you not become a crowbar and bore a hole to reach them? If they become a fish and enter the Tengiz Sea, won't you, Subede, become a fishing net and strain through the water to catch them? So similar types of metaphors. So without question, Rashid ad-Din is quoting in his usual Persianized paraphrase a Mongolian document. Could this have been the actual charge issued to the commanders? I think that's quite unlikely, because the document predicts a 3-year campaign ending with them circling the Caspian Sea and returning via the waste of Kipchak, the Dashti Kipchak. But such an ex-event to prophecy must be retrospective. And that means in turn that Rashid ad-Din cannot be citing a contemporary document. He must be citing a history. And this history was, we will see, also used by the secret historian and by compilers of the authentic chronicle of Chinggis Khan. Following the account of the pursuit of the Sultan and his death, Rashid ad-Din quotes another intra-Mongol communication with no parallel in the Persian sources. Hearing of the Sultan's death and the flight of his son to eastern Afghanistan, Subede and Jebe now asked for permission to return to Mongolia via the Kipchak steppe. quote, when Sultan Jalaluddin took flight from Nishapur and headed to Ghazni, Jebin Subud sent a messenger to Chinggis Khan to say, Sultan Muhammad has died and his son Jalaluddin has fled in that direction. We are no longer worried about him, and in accordance with your command, we will spend a year or two conquering as many lands that lie before us as we can, and then return by the Kipchak steppe to the rendezvous point commanded in Mongolia, God willing, and through Chinggis Khan's fortunes. Now, this message is somewhat contradictory because it seems to say, or sort of offer as a new, passing through the Kipchak lands is now advanced as a new idea. This passage clearly refers to the previous command. And the phrase God willing and through Chinggis Khan's fortune is once again the same famous Mongolian formula, by the power of eternal heaven, by the fortune of the Khan. So this passage, I think, has to be associated with the first, both being part of a single Mongolian history, not contemporary documents, but histories. Rashid also paraphrased two additional Mongolian documents. In his account of the Great Western Expedition from 1236 to 1234, he divides it into two parts, one under the reign of Ogedei and the other under the annals of the reign of Ogedei, the other under the rubric of events in the Kipchak, events related to the Kipchak princes during Ogedei's reign. In fact, however, this division is artificial, and he clearly derives his material, part of it is from Joveni, and the other part is from a Mongolian outline of events. So when the two parts are put together, we can see that he took a continuous Mongol outline history, dated year by year to the 12 animal cycle, from the monkey year of 1236 to the snake year of 1243. And it's interesting, it's festooned with several names that neither Rashid-ad-Din nor modern scholars have been able to identify. Into his translation of that year by year outline, he inserted two accounts taken from Juveni. One, Monke capturing Bachman, that same parting the waters theme, and second, Batu and the Battle of Muhi. For some reason, he omitted the siege of Magas in Caucasus. To these Joveni-based materials, he added a few new touches, a few new names, and he replaced the word Keller for Hungary with Bolar. It's a mistake, but he eventually didn't know. Persians had known the word Bolar for quite a while. Keller was a new one. Finally, since Rashid-ad-Din had moved the Monke parts of the water story from the story of his rise, where Juveni had placed it, into the annals of Ogedei, Rashid-ad-Din could use a different account of that and similar events. But this time, it's cast as a nomination speech by Batu at the Kurultai of 1251, where they first decide that they're going to make Batu the next Khan. So Batu has his nomination speech. He's such a great guy. This is what he did in this Great Western Expedition. And this speech, too, it bristles with names mentioned nowhere else, which is a good sign that it's a citation from a Mongolian original. Moreover, interesting, those names that are new and different don't agree with those that are new and different in the earlier Mongol origin outline from in Ogedei's annals. And in fact, in the case of what's the name of the Asut or Ossetian leader that Monke Khan captured, it's actually different in the two sources. So evidently this speech's text is from a different source than the Mongolian outline which Rashid-ad-Din used in his Annals of Ogedei. Now finally, we come to the Secret History of the Mongols. The Secret History of the Mongols is obviously a Mongolian source, but as I've shown in a number of articles, it's not just a Mongolian source of I would regard as the early Monke period, from first drafted in the Mouse year of 1252. But it's also an anthology of previous Mongolian sources, albeit previous sources used with considerable freedom. In many cases, the secret historian seems to be quoting earlier Mongolian sources as part of a sort of a war against them, a way of changing their interpretation. Certainly, the secret historian's account of the Western expeditions shares little with any of these other accounts that I've talked about so far, even though, as I will demonstrate, the historian did use some of the same sources. But as elsewhere, the secret history is an example of how creative editing and replacement of the text in the final work can radically change the impression which that work gives. Now, secret history begins its discussion of the conquest of the Kipchak West with a lengthy charge given by Chinggis Khan to Sebete to pursue the sons of the Merkit ruler Tokta-Beki into the Kipchak West. That's this first one. Many phrases in this charge recall those in the charge quoted by Rashid-ad-Din. They're similar, but they're not actually exactly the same. Others recall the warning which in the early part of the biography of Tutkak Chinggis Khan gave to the Ulberli Kipchak ruler Inas, warning him from sheltering the market. So in the Tutkat biography, it's a moose with an arrow in it. In the Secrets of the Mongols, it's a deer with an arrow in it, Bolk or Handage. Handage is moose, Bolk is deer. Not exactly the same, but similar. Compared to this lengthy charge, however, the actual execution of that campaign in the Secrets of the Mongols is dispatched in a single sentence. So a complex sentence, but it's a single sentence. The charge and the narrative are probably actually not from the same source. Factually, however, the secret historian confused numerous later scholars by guessing that this cow year is actually 1217 one, not the 1217 one, which would have been correct, but the 1205 one. And also changed the name of the river from Chem to Chui, which is confused a lot of people. Similarly, the secret story quoted a historical source on the dispatch of Jebbe, Subed, and Tokhachar to chase down the Sultan Muhammad. And each one is described as his Gidzik. So Subed is the Gidzik, literally pigtail, but here meaning reinforcement. And Tokhachar was Subed's Gidzik. It then follows with a narrative of how Tokhachar violated his charge, driving the Khwarezmian commander Khan Malik into opposition, and ultimately resulting in Chinggis Khan having to pursue him and the young Khwarezmian Sultan Jalaluddin down to the banks of the Indus River. For reasons I will discuss below, this passage can be linked both to the charge and message cited by Rashid ad-Din in his account of Jebbe and Subed's expedition, and to a history of the campaign in Afghanistan and India cited by the authentic chronicle of Chinggis Khan's. But the secret historian again messed things up historically by placing this at the beginning of the Khwarezmian campaign, not in its middle. Following the conclusion of the Khwarezmian campaign, we find three separate passages in the Secrets of the Mongols that refer to what must be a single campaign, the Great Western Campaign of 1235 to 1242. These passages cover the Secrets of the Mongols, sections 262, 270, and 274. They share a highly distinctive set of attributes, a common list of 11 targets, including, strangely enough, Kashmir at one point. 2 rivers to cross, the Ijil or the Volga and the Jaik or the Ural River, and 2 or 3 cities to sack, Magat and Menkerman and Kiev. In this conception, Subed is a leader of the expedition from late in Chinggis Khan's reign all the way up through Ogade's. There's a common list of 4 princes heading off as reinforcements, representing the 4 branches of the Chinggis family. And finally, there's a placement of this expedition in a list of other expeditions, always next to an expeditions of Chormakhan against Baghdad. So are these 3 passages cited from other sources, or are they original to the secret historia? The frequent repetition of the same material across the Chinggis Khan Ogadeh reign division seems to be more likely to indicate a citation from a previous source. Yet the whole historical scenario is so idiosyncratic to the secret historian, it seems impossible that all of it can be derived from some other document. Nobody else believed this same thing about the history that the secret historian believed. Moreover, there are differences in, for example, the way of writing the name of Volga and of Kiev, so suggests that in some cases at least, the secret historian is rewriting the list from memory. In other words, wrote it once and then rewrote it by memory, accidentally substituting the historian's own term for what was found in the sources. So my own feeling is that I think the repeated core of the passages in which Subed is dispatched across the Ijil and Jaik against 11 people in 3 cities, that's derived from a previously existing passage. But much of the surrounding material is then recreated by the secret historian. Now, finally, there's the following passage of Secret History 270, section 275 to 277, with its famous quarrel between Batu and the rival princes. Buri and Guyuk, they mention at this point the rival princes Buri and Guyuk. This section mentions 11 peoples, but otherwise is not closely connected to the preceding passage. And given the extremely sensitive nature of this text, with accusations of effeminacy against Batu and brutality against Guyuk, it seems hardly likely the secret historian could be citing a previous written source. So let's draw connections. And we'll wrap it up. So what sort of previous identified Mongolian language materials do these analytical observations excavate? Let me review the sources I've identified in rough chronological order of the topic they deal with. We have a biography of Sube'etei, biography of Ismail. We have Sube'etei's campaign against the Merkit and the Odberli Kipchak, which is cited in the authentic chronicle of Genghis Khan. But we also have a lengthy chart to Sube'etei on occasion of this same campaign used by the secret historian. We have a biography of the Kipchak family that also has a reference to that campaign against the Merkit in 1217. Then we have an account of the dispatch of the three commanders to pursue the Sultan with a charge from Genghis Khan and a message from them to Genghis Khan. And that comes from a source that was used by the secret history, the authentic chronicle of Genghis Khan, and by Rashid ad-Din. We have a summary of Sube'etei's campaign across the Ijil and Jayak rivers against 11 nations. This is a Great Western Expedition. It's found in the secret history of the Mongols. An analytic description of the same conquests in Rashid ad-Din. And then we have these 4 accounts, all of which are basically glorifying Guyuk or Monke, one or the other. And then finally, Batu's nomination speech. This is a real potpourri. Can we simplify the picture by connecting some of them to each other? Perhaps. It does seem likely that I think all of these versions of Monke, glorifying Monke and sacking Magas, it seems to be a single behind them all should be some single literary description of Mongolian that was then abbreviated and modified by later Persian, Chinese, and other authors. Interestingly, Sube'etei's biography of 1248 knows nothing of this great capture of Bachman by Monke and attributes it to Sube'etei instead. The account of Monke parting the waters and capturing Bachman was probably written right around the time of his coup in 1251 as a fairly transparent piece of political propaganda. Other sources can be linked, but in ways that draw them away from the Western conquest theme. Thus, this third source, Sube'etei's campaign against the Merkit, seems to be part of a narrative that actually is the conclusion of the conquest of the Naman and the Merkit. There's a separate narrative there, and doesn't go on into any other later Western expeditions. The 6th source listed, this one here at the bottom of this left-hand column. This is linked up to several other source blocks and hence can be built into a fairly lengthy narrative. But this lengthy narrative is really more about the campaigns in Persia and eventually goes down into India and doesn't follow Sube'etei into the Kipchak steppe. So as far as information about the Kipchaks, the Mongolian part about it is not particularly useful. And the most frustrating way is the way in which the secret historians, that secret historians' Mongolian source doesn't seem to match Rashid ad-Din's Mongolian sources and doesn't seem to match the Sube'etei's biography. Whether Sube'etei's 1248 biography, the analytic survey by Rashid ad-Din from 1236 to 1243, or the brief summary in the secret history, or the speech attributed to Batu praising Monke Khan, all of them have a lot of names and they have a lot of events. But mostly they're not the same names and mostly not the same events. So how they're actually interrelated, if at all, and what their original format may have been is still really rather mysterious to me. So in conclusion, I'd like to briefly touch on a peculiar feature the Mongolian sources have described, and that is with a few exceptions, they show very little interest in battles. They seem much more interested in the rhetoric, falcons taking refuge in bushes and people digging in like marmots and so on. And they show a lot of interest in human relations between commanders, what Buri said to Batu and so on. Battles are at most listed one by one in order. Now, one of the few exceptions to this is the biography of Sube'etei, which as a result has become a common source for the study of the Battle of Muhi. For example, in one of Stephen Powell's articles is a nice example in that regard. But that actually seems rather exceptional. And even in that case, the real point of the description of the battle seems to be to show how Batu was dependent on Sube'etei's help. Once again, it's about human relations, not so much about the battle. So this lack of military detail I find is quite puzzling, since all the other evidence points to a highly precise, professional, and I would argue cumulative knowledge base of Mongolian commanders. They got better as time went on. They were clearly collecting and processing information. One can only conclude that this professional military knowledge base was held by a separate body of people who were not part of the Mongolian language historical conversation. So whether these military specialists were transmitting their information entirely orally or to some extent written, the knowledge base of the Mongolian commanders was never communicated in real time to historians. Only after death, it seems, was in a few cases some of this knowledge communicated to biographers, such as whoever wrote the biography of Suede. Historical texts are thus likely to show only a small part of the Mongol conquest, and even if the Mongolian sources give something of an insider view, that insider view does not seem to have included the specific insiders who planned and executed the Mongol conquests. Thank you. I'd be happy to take questions.